to get a UK passport, you have to naturalise, you have to pay £1,330, and there's a whole load of hassle involved with that. Can you explain why that is, how it's compliant with the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, and what might be done?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to come and give evidence. I think this is my 6th Select Committee since taking on the role of Immigration Minister on a wide range of subjects, so I appreciate that this is a very specific one. I am very conscious that there is a difference in the way the British government and the Irish governments treat applications for passports. For the British government, it is crucially important to us that we uphold the Belfast Agreement and that we absolutely respect the right of individuals from Northern Ireland to decide whether they wish to have a British passport, an Irish passport, or both, and that's an absolute given in a now 20-year-old treaty. However, for Irish citizens who have chosen to come and live in Northern Ireland, you're quite right to point out that there is a difference, that they are obliged to naturalise in exactly the same way that we would expect any other person coming to the United Kingdom to naturalise, and there is a cost involved. And as you pointed out, it's £1,330, £1,250 of which is the naturalisation fee and £80 for the citizenship fee. This is all set out in legislation, and of course you'll be aware that successive immigration acts dating back to 2007 have enabled the government to not only charge the cost of processing these applications, but also to, from the fees raised, may use that towards the overall security of the border and for our immigration and citizenship processes.
Thank you. Gregory Campbell.
Minister, you outlined there the government's position to date, and you did use the phrase crucially important about upholding the Belfast Agreement and subsequent agreements. I'm just wondering, are you familiar with what the agreement actually says about citizenship?
Well, that it respects the right of the individual to determine whether they wish to be British, Irish or both.
Yeah, the quote is that the government recognises the birthright of all the people of Northern Ireland to identify themselves and be accepted as Irish or British or both as they may so choose. Mm-hmm. That's the exact quote. And yet, as the chairman has outlined, if you were born across the border in the Irish Republic at any occasion since 1949 and have lived in Northern Ireland from the day after you were born. In other words, you could be living as a resident, taxpayer, employee and voter for 68 years in Northern Ireland. And if you tried to get a British passport, you would fall foul of something that you shouldn't fall foul of according to that sentence in the Belfast Agreement.
Well, I think we have a long established agreement that we seek to uphold, but the fact is that an Irish citizen holding an Irish passport who has lived in Northern Ireland for 68 years comes under the scope of successive immigration acts that require naturalisation.
But you've said that the government thinks it's crucially important that you uphold the agreement which says that people can identify themselves and be accepted as Irish or British or both as they may so choose. Now, I mean, I have both passports with me. And the point here is that I, as a UK citizen, apply for that passport, pay the fee and get it. Someone who is my neighbour in Northern Ireland but happens to have been born in 1950 or 51 or 61 or 71 or 81 and have lived all their lives in Northern Ireland, pay the same taxes as I do, they have to buy this passport in a trouble-free way because they can't get this one because of the immigration legislation. And it's quite clearly in contravention of that sentence as contained in the Belfast Agreement.
Well, we do extend to Irish citizens, as you'll be aware, settled status from day one, and they have the right to naturalise after 5 years as opposed to 6 years, which would be the case for people coming from other countries to the UK. But I entirely accept and understand the point that you're making, but that is the position as it is. They are required to naturalise. But please be assured I have taken on board that point.
Well, I'm glad you said that that's the position as it is, because the position needs to change. Because if you think of the anomaly, someone who resides in Northern Ireland wasn't born in the Republic and perhaps has never even been to the Republic can get this passport by completing the application form and sending off the fee. They may never even have been to the Irish Republic, let alone born in it. But people who've lived in the UK for 60 odd years can't get this passport with the same ease as this one. And yet many of those people regard themselves as British, as UK citizens, as taxpayers, as residents for decades. It is quite clearly an anomaly that has to be changed, it has to be rectified. Either that or you abandon that section of the agreement which you've said is crucially important to the British government. You can't do both.
Well, and indeed we have done both. And you'll be conscious that for many years since the Belfast Agreement, 20 years, we have retained the requirement for Irish citizens, should they wish to have a British passport, to naturalise. Of course, they don't have to. It's a personal choice whether they wish to apply for a British passport. And many do, but equally many do not. But of course, what we recognise is that Irish citizens living in Northern Ireland do not have to naturalise in order to be able to access services. As I said, they are deemed to have settled status from literally day one, and so they are in a different position to many other nationalities who might choose to apply to come to the UK and settle here and make their lives in the United Kingdom. But I'm conscious that you regard it as an anomaly, but it is a long-standing situation.
It is a long-standing situation, but it's one that can't continue. Do you accept, for example, that the anomaly, as I've described it, and you've agreed that it is an anomaly, that the two citizens, one who holds a British passport, the other who doesn't particularly want an Irish passport, but has to have it because they can't get a British passport unless they go through the tortuous route of naturalisation and paying an exorbitant fee, which the Irish citizen doesn't have to do, even if they've never been to the Irish Republic. They don't have to do that. Their country, their government in the Irish Republic doesn't require that of them. But their own government in their own country does. That's something that can't continue.
So, their own government in their own country. The country, they are Irish citizens.
No, they are residents in Northern Ireland and they want to be British.
But they have Irish citizenship.
But they want, under the terms of the agreement, which you say is crucially important to the government, they want to have this passport with the same ease as others have this one. They don't want any distinction. No, there's no compulsion involved. Those who want this passport can have it. Those who want this one can't.
But it is a process that we expect people who come to the United Kingdom to go through naturalisation before they're eligible for a British passport.
But Minister, the important thing about this is the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement is really very clear. It talks about the right of the people of Northern Ireland to identify themselves and be accepted as Irish, British or both. Now, those words are either rhetorical or they have meaning. Meaning means being able to be British and hold a British passport. Now, clearly, those words at the moment are inappropriate insofar as we put up a real hurdle to people wishing to have a British passport, which is not the case for people who wish to have or find it expedient to have an Irish passport. And accepting everything that you have said, do you not agree with me that there is an issue around the aspirations outlined in the Good Friday Agreement and reality at the moment in the way that Mr. Campbell has outlined?
Well, I absolutely accept, as both you and Mr. Campbell have outlined, that there is an issue. What I cannot and will not do is seek to make sweeping assumptions about the intentions behind a treaty that was agreed 20 years ago, long before I came to this place. And I certainly cannot sit here and change that.
I interrupted.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Sorry, Minister, when you say you can't change that, do you mean change the agreement or change the government's attitude to it?
Okay, so I certainly can't change the agreement, which enshrined rights very clearly. I've certainly listened very carefully to the points that you have made about the situation, and I understand that there are very strong feelings about this, but the situation remains that a person holding Irish citizenship living in Northern Ireland has to go through the naturalisation process, and that is not something that I can sit here and simply change.
Well, Chairman, just to conclude, I mean, the position at the moment and for some time is that thousands of people in Northern Ireland who were born in the Republic are treated in a second-class citizenship way because they have an inferior approach to citizenship in terms of their desire to be recognised and acknowledged as British citizens. They want to have and hold a British passport. There's no clearer symbol of their nationhood than a passport, and that applies to whatever country the person belongs to. Now, that being the case, under the terms of the agreement, which you've said is crucially important, they are denied that right unless they go through a tortuous route that isn't applicable to others who want to have their right enshrined as Irish citizens. So I think, Chairman, rather than create a circular argument here, I think I've made my point. Hopefully the committee will agree and we can bring this to a satisfactory conclusion, because it has continued for much, much too long.
Okay. Before I come to Robert Goodwill, can I just draw your attention to the Annunciator and the fact that at 12:30 the division bell will sound so that we have a 2:30 to allow us 1 minute's silence to remember the people who were affected by the Manchester outrage a year ago. So I will ask you to rise at that point and keep a minute's silence. Robert Goodwill.
Thank you. Minister, many of the border immigration issues affecting Northern Ireland rely on close cooperation with the Republic. Quite recently, the UK introduced exit checks because we were often criticised of not knowing who was in the country. People came in with a visa, but they left. One of the flaws in that is the way the Common Travel Area works. So if an American tourist arrives at Heathrow and leaves via Shannon, or if a person does that sort of journey, we don't pick them up. Can you report, has there been any progress in trying to sort of work more closely with the Republic in order to coordinate both entry and certainly exit checks, so we actually know who has overstayed their visa and who's actually left without being noticed?
So our relationship with Ireland when it comes to borders is obviously of crucial importance, and the external border of the Common Travel Area is always of keen interest. We continue to work closely on both sides in order to be conscious of who is coming in and out of the United Kingdom. I am aware, of course, that there is scope for people to travel across a significant land border very easily, but it remains imperative that we work closely with the Irish Republic to make sure that we have the best information that we possibly can. Of course, some of the best information comes from advanced passenger information that the airlines are obliged to share with both of us, and I'm conscious that there are many airlines who embrace that enthusiastically, others who are less enthusiastic about it, but having seen how closely Border Force work across a range of agencies, I can confirm that that remains crucially important information to us. I'm conscious, as the Immigration Minister, however, that we still have more work to do more widely, and I don't refer specifically to crossings of the Irish Sea, but when it comes to train and ferry movements in and out of the United Kingdom.
Okay. One of the other issues which may well benefit the UK when it leaves the European Union is that we can decide which documents we will accept for travel, and I know there are loopholes and security lapses with Greek and Italian ID documents which are not biometric, which can be obtained from a town hall. Are there any conversations with the Republic to try and improve the robustness of our entry checks to enable us to move away from that rather flawed system to one where only biometric documents are taken? And if that was the case, would we have to then also make a secure agreement from the Irish Republic along those lines?
So our continuing negotiations with the EU have up until recently focused around or there have been discussions about biometric passports, which I will very happily say are my personal preferred documents for travel more widely across the European Union. Mr. Goodwill has highlighted very clearly that particularly there are some nationalities who use identity cards which are far less secure than biometric passports, and I have concerns that moving forward, as we move into a new immigration system post-Brexit, that we will get to a position where we will no longer accept those. But that is some 5 years after exit, after our negotiations with the EU. But obviously those are conversations that will be ongoing both with the EU but particularly with Ireland, because I'm very conscious that that could potentially be seen as an easier route in, because of course Ireland will still be obliged to accept the less secure travel documents that some of the EU 27 still enable their citizens to use.
Thank you. Okay, Tony.
Thank you. Minister, do you accept, as the chairman and both my colleague Gregory has said, that the way this works at the moment is contrary to the Belfast Agreement?
So no, I don't think it's contrary to the Belfast Agreement, but I'm certainly listening to the concerns of the committee on this subject.
So why is it not contrary to the Belfast Agreement wording that was read out?
Because, and I'm not convinced that it's entirely fair for me to expect me to interpret a treaty that is 20 years old. However, I'm very conscious that that presumably referred to citizens of Northern Ireland at that date. And so I've certainly listened to the committee's concerns about this, but as I interpret it, the right was extended to citizens of Northern Ireland to either have Irish citizenship, Northern Irish citizenship, or both. And presumably those who held Irish passports on that date were deemed to be Irish citizens, not citizens of Northern Ireland, irrespective of where they were living.
Sorry, there's not a Northern Irish citizenship. We don't have a Northern
British
Ireland
citizenship.
passport.
Sorry, British citizenship.
So would you just, for clarification, just repeat again why you think it is not contrary
So
to
a British citizen would have had the choice to retain their British citizenship, to have Irish citizenship, or to have both. I assume that the case was that for an Irish citizen living in Northern Ireland at that time, they were deemed to have Irish citizenship, not British citizenship. And therefore, I assume that is how the Belfast Agreement has worked over the last 20 years.
Do you know how many people are in this situation? Has your department looked at this, given the interest there's been over a period of time with questions being asked and so on? So is there a number of people?
I don't have a number, no.
You don't have a number, but do you think your department has a number?
I suspect that they probably do, but I don't have that number.
Could you check that, please?
Yes, I'm very happy to check that and get back to the committee.
Now, you've said that it's not contrary to the Belfast Agreement. Do you think it fits in with the other well-known phrase to do with the Belfast Agreement, parity of esteem? Parity of esteem. You've heard of parity of esteem. Do you think this fits in with that definition of parity of esteem, that people are being treated so differently?
Well, I find that very difficult to answer because, of course, an Irish citizen living in Northern Ireland has a right to access the same goods and services. They are deemed to have settled status from day one. They will be able to apply for naturalisation earlier than somebody who had come from outside, from a third country, who had come to the United Kingdom to settle. So I think that they have those rights, but they do have to go through the same process of naturalisation and a citizenship ceremony that we would expect of other third country nationals.
And do you think that's fair?
Well, I think that's across the board fair to those people who have chosen to settle in the United Kingdom, yes. They are extended additional rights.
Have you ever read any Irish history?
Not for a very long time.
I'm amazed at that kind of response. Don't you see the difference between someone in that position and someone who's, come in from a different country, out of Ireland, and come and become a British citizen and gets naturalisation? Don't you see any difference between that and people who lived in the island of Ireland?
Well, we extend settled status from day one, and they have a quicker route to naturalisation than anybody else would.
But they have to pay a lot of money.
And the same would be true for any person seeking British citizenship.
But they're not just any person. That's the point. I mean, I genuinely don't think you seem to understand.
No, I absolutely understand
the difference.
That there are very strong feelings on this. I think Mr. Campbell made the point very clearly that anybody born after 49 would, and who had potentially lived in Northern Ireland from pretty much from birth, but who had Irish citizenship. I can understand that there is a feeling of difference. However, I have to stand by the immigration rules, which are very clear on this matter.
I accept that, but do you, as a minister, not have also the right to think, hang on, this is something in my department that is crazy, this is ridiculous, particularly in the current circumstances of the Belfast Agreement and all of that. I will do something about it. I mean, can you at least give us that commitment?
Well, as I said to Mr. Campbell, I've listened to his very strong feelings on this. I'm now listening to yours. This is certainly something that the view of the committee I will reflect upon.
And perhaps act on.
I will certainly give it consideration.
Minister, thank you for that. That's very good news. I think it's important to nail this at this particular juncture in our history, since we are about to leave the European Union. And whilst, of course, up to this point, all of those living resident in the British Isles could say that they were in some way covered by their membership of the European Union. That will no longer be the case for a significant number of us. So these issues of nationality and passports are going to become more acute, are they not? So it might be a good juncture, given the undertakings you have made, perhaps to do this with some degree of alacrity and urgency, so that we can ensure that the relatively small number of people, though your department will probably have some better idea of the numbers, are not discommoded in the way that they currently are, and has been very elegantly described by Mr. Campbell in particular. Lady Hearn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Minister, it's very good of you to come to give us evidence this afternoon. I was particularly struck by your words that the British government, in the attitude of the British government, it's crucially important that we, being the British government, uphold the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. And you're nodding your head in agreement. I just ask you if you've read the Belfast Agreement.
Not in its entirety, no.
So it is crucially important to the British government to uphold the Belfast Agreement, but you as the Immigration Minister, looking at passports, looking at the issue that we were asking for evidence and invited evidence this afternoon, did not think fit to actually read the Belfast Agreement in its entirety.
I haven't read the whole document, no.
Have you ever read it in the 20 years since we marked its anniversary this year? Have you ever read it in its entirety?
No, I haven't, but 20 years ago I think I was probably giving birth. And I've been Immigration Minister for 5 months.
Yes, you've been Immigration Minister for 5 months, but And in those 5 months, we've marked the 20th anniversary, which you mentioned in your opening remarks. So, as the Minister with responsibility for immigration, passports and visas, may I just ask you, given that you yourself haven't actually read the agreement, what level of awareness could we expect from other members, officials in your team?
Enormous, and I think the Chairman just alluded to the departure from the European Union, which is now imminent. I am very conscious that for EU citizens, and I include amongst them British citizens currently and Irish citizens going forward, that we are in a time of change, that we have the December agreement and the importance of upholding citizens' rights, and also the fact that since 1922 we have had bilateral agreements with Ireland, which have extended rights to Irish citizens who choose to come and live in Great Britain, the United Kingdom, which will be important to uphold going forward. I am very conscious that we will have to make sure that the process of transition through the implementation period and beyond works in the interests of British citizens living in the EU 27 as well as EU 27 living here. So of course it's important to me and officials.
That wasn't quite the question. The question was, given the fact that you as a minister have not read the Belfast Agreement yourself, I asked about the level of awareness in officials within your department who are handling visa and passport applications, their level of awareness of the Belfast Agreement, and you said enormous?
Sorry, and I meant to go on to say that, of course, throughout all of those discussions and reflections on what will happen in March next year, of course, discussions about the common travel area and about the rights of Irish citizens are a very significant part of that.
Well, let me give you an example, without naming names, of a constituent of mine who was born at the Ulster Hospital, just outside Belfast. His birth certificate was sent to the Home Office with his application for a British passport. He was issued with a British passport. When it expired, he, exercising his rights under the agreement, which he's perfectly entitled to do, because it was so much less expensive, applied for an Irish passport. And it was assumed when he tried to apply for a visa for his wife from outside the EU that he was an Irish citizen. This happened within the last 6 months. The Home Office already had his birth certificate, clearly identifying having been born at the Dundalk Hospital, the Ulster Hospital in Belfast. He'd had a British passport under the terms of the Belfast Agreement, which you said was crucially important. The department, your department, actually turned down the visa application for his wife, even though he was entitled to both British citizenship, and he'd exercised that, and Irish citizenship, and he'd exercised that, and he's entitled to both. So how can you claim that your department is well aware of the provisions of the Belfast Agreement?
I'm sorry, so I can't comment on why his wife's visa application was turned down.
It was assumed that he was an Irish citizen living in Northland. That was why. And one would have thought, since your officials were well aware of the...
Well, of course, an Irish citizen living in the United Kingdom would have greater rights to bring a third country national in, because obviously under the EU rules, EU citizens living within the United Kingdom are not subject to the minimum income threshold.
That wasn't quite the point. It was turned
No,
because he was an Irish
what
citizen.
I can't do is I can't comment on an individual case in a select committee. I'm very happy if you want to provide me with the details to take that away and look at it.
Order. Lady Herman.
Thank you. Minister, I wasn't asking you to comment on an individual case which I've already raised with your department at the time of the problem. What I am asking you is to confirm that the officials in your department are aware of the entitlement under the Belfast Agreement in terms of those in Northern Ireland to both British or Irish, or indeed both, citizenship to both.
Yes.
And your department is well aware of that?
Yes.
Excellent. Right, that will take us neatly on to the UK Border Force recruitment drive earlier this year. And so your department is well aware of the provisions of the agreement. However, they advertised in the UK, let me repeat that, the UK Border Force recruitment drive across the UK, of which Northern Ireland is part. Despite that, they managed to advertise for British passports only. How did that arise if your department's officials are so acutely aware of the implications of the Belfast Agreement?
It was an error, which they amended as soon as it was drawn to their attention.
And how many posts had been filled at that stage? It's reported that 300 posts had already been filled, is that correct?
But at that point they went back to all applicants indicating the error that had been made. It is a long-running nationwide recruitment process. You'll be aware that we are seeking to recruit a significant number of Border Force officers to tackle the challenge of Brexit. We have apologised and corrected that error.
May I just ask you again, had any posts actually been filled at the time that the mistake was identified and acknowledged by your department?
I am not aware of any posts having been filled, but of course the recruitment process was underway. It is a rigorous and lengthy selection process, but I can't answer the question as to how many may or may not have been appointed. It was an error that was identified, brought to our attention quickly.
And how did it happen? How did this error happen when everyone, including the British government, are so crucially aware of the importance of the agreement?
It was a mistake. It was
human error, a blind eye being turned.
Well, certainly it was not a recruitment campaign that was signed off by ministers. This would have been within Border Force that the mistake was made. And
right, so the mistake was made by Border Force.
Very happy to apologise on their behalf for it, but we took steps to correct it to make sure that the recruitment process was fair and available to those who had both British passports and held dual nationality. I am very sorry that it happened.
Well, thank you for that, and I am really pleased that you used the word fair. Fair. Minister, you've just sort of pulled a face when I...
No, I haven't, sorry, I was just flicking, and I hoped that I was going to get to the correct page in my pack, and I didn't.
Well, in the latest amended recruitment drive, you will be aware, because I did write to you and I have had a signed reply from you, so you will be well aware that actually the criteria that have been used by the UK Border Force, and I'm repeating, the UK-wide Border Force, so this is the employer for everyone being recruited across the UK, the criteria being applied in Northern Ireland is discriminatory as compared to the criteria used in Scotland, Wales and England, in that military service in Northern Ireland is not a key criteria as compared to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England, if I said right. So how is that recruitment procedure fair or indeed legal? It is discriminatory, patently discriminatory.
So it's not a requirement, but it can still be taken into consideration?
Not on an equal, fair basis with military service anywhere else in the United Kingdom.
Well, I would argue that it is on an equal basis, but it's not a requirement that people should have had to have had it.
Oh, absolutely not a requirement, quite the opposite. If one had military service in England, Scotland or Wales, it was the key criteria, but in Northern Ireland, service, for example, in the Royal Irish Regiment was not a criteria that was going to be the key criteria. It was not treated on an equal basis with applicants from England, Scotland or Wales. How can that happen in what you've described as a fair process?
Well, you describe it as not a key criteria, but of course it is a criteria that is anybody's experience is looked at and considered.
No, it wasn't. So, for example, military experience in England, Scotland or Wales was the key criteria, so that if an applicant did not have 2 A-levels, their military experience counted. It was the top criteria. But in Northern Ireland, it was their academic qualifications, 2 A-levels, rather than their military experience which counted. That's clearly discriminatory. Now, at the last Northern Ireland questions, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland indicated in reply to the Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley that she had actually taken this up with the Home Office. So what were the representations made by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to the Home Office? And what was the outcome of those representations?
So one point that I would like to make was that the requirement was removed in Northern Ireland by Border Force following concerns that had been raised by the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland on using military and law enforcement as a specific criterion. But when it comes to specific representations made to me by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I'm not aware of any specific representations. That does not mean that they have not come into the department, but I have not seen them.
And you haven't spoken, or the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has not actually spoken to you about this issue?
No, I don't believe so.
That is absolutely astonishing, I have to say. It is a really serious issue in terms of discrimination against those who have served in the armed forces in Northern Ireland. And it has affected a large number of people who feel extremely hurt and offended by it, by a British government who claims that they always salute those who have served Queen and country. But when it comes to applying to the UK Border Force, that doesn't seem to hold true. Perhaps when the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has spoken to the Home Office, you could come back to us and just
I will certainly be happy to confirm any representations that she has already made, and indeed any future representations that she might make on this subject.
And has that discriminatory procedure now been dropped because of intervention?
Well,
I understand that the Equality Commission has indicated that it should be fair across the board.
Well, the information that I have is that the removal of the criterion was necessary to ensure compliance with the Fair Employment and Equal Treatment Order Northern Ireland 1998.
And what did that mean? What did that contain?
Well, that means that the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland raised this as a concern, and we were obliged to remove it.
Sorry.
It still means that we can take into account the experience and the knowledge of people who've worked in the military and law enforcement, and both current and former members are free to apply for all of our recruitment campaigns.
Yeah.
But this was a concern that was raised with us by the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland.
Why did the Equality Commission see fit to raise it with you? What was their reason for doing that, do you think?
Well, they wanted it to be compliant with the Fair Employment and Equal Treatment Order.
Yes, that's what your letter to me actually quoted, that particular order, but what does that actually mean in substance? How does that translate into reality? What was the issue that the Equality Commission, what possible issue could the Equality Commission have been concerned about?
Well, I can't answer what the specific concern was, except that I would have assumed that it was because...
So was this again a mistake having been made by the UK Border Force? This is their recruitment drive, so is the mistake made by them, or is it made by your department?
So the Border Force is part of the Home Office, but it is important that we make sure that all of our recruitment campaigns are compliant with equality legislation.
Particularly when it's across the United Kingdom, it was the UK Border Force recruitment. One would like to think that in fact it was fair across the United Kingdom. I'm sure you would agree with that.
Yes.
Can
I interrupt? Because I know Kate Hoey is bursting.
Well, no,
yes, of
just
course.
I might come in on the same thing, but if you want,
absolutely, please.
Yeah.
I mean, this is amazing. I find this quite shocking, really. I mean, can you just say who will have read that Equality Commission submission? Is that public, presumably?
I would assume that it's public, but that will have gone to the Border Force.
So this decision would have been made by an official, not by a minister?
Yeah.
So you knew nothing about it until
it was raised publicly because of the issues that Lady Herman is
And again,
discussing.
can you, getting back to almost the original questions that we were talking to you about, do you think this is fair? That people in Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, are treated so differently?
Well, I think we have to respect the Equalities
Well, you
Commission
haven't
on
even,
this.
have you read the Equality Commission submission?
No.
Well, can we ask formally, Mr. Chairman, to actually get that Equality Commission? I'd like to read it.
I think so, and I think, Minister, you really must read this, because these are extremely sensitive issues, and I would expect a report of this sort from the Equalities Commission to be considered by the Minister making the decision ultimately, so that she can make an informed determination on this issue.
So this is not a ministerial decision?
Well,
this was a recruitment campaign by Border
Minister,
Force.
you're in charge of your department.
Absolutely, but you
need
just said
to know
that
this stuff.
you just
And
said
if
that
you're-
before a
if you're-
minister
if
made the
you're-
decision,
if
and
your
it was
officials-
not a ministerial decision.
If your officials are doing this kind of thing without your knowledge, I would suggest you go back to officials and ask the basis on which they are making their decision, because these matters, as you've heard today, are of the most enormous sensitivity in the context of Northern Ireland.
I absolutely respect that, but recruitment campaigns cannot be done at a ministerial level. This is an official.
The framework in which those decisions are made have to be exposed to ministers, I suggest to you, and this is an area, it seems to me, on the basis of what we have heard today in evidence, an area where there has been something of a mission, and I would ask you to go back to
Absolutely.
the Parliament and ask what's going on.
I'm very happy to do that.
Thank you. Lady Hammond, did you want to come back?
Yes, I did, just Minister, on the day in which your letter came through to me, it was dated the 11th of May, Friday the 11th of May, 2018, and on that very same day, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland published her consultation on how we're going to deal with the legacy of the past. And on the covering letter, on the front page of that consultation paper, the Secretary of State signed off a letter in which she said that her government, the current government, could not repeat often enough the pledge and the recognition that the British government had of the courage and the sacrifice of our armed forces. That was the pledge given by the Secretary of State on behalf of the government to those who served in the armed forces. I would suggest to you that the letter that you signed off to me was clearly discriminatory in the recruitment procedure for UK border officials and ought to be abandoned forthwith. It is clearly discriminatory and does not salute the courage and service of those in Northern Ireland who served with the Royal Irish Regiment or other forces in Northern Ireland, from Northern Ireland, and who served courageously and well. Could I have your commitment that that policy will be withdrawn when you go back to your department?
I think it is really important that we act within the law, that we do not discriminate against anybody in our recruitment processes and in our advertisements. That is your view. I don't believe that we have been discriminatory, and I think we have worked hard to make sure that our recruitment processes meet the requirements of the Equality Commission.
And you are saying that in the absence of having read the advice from the Equality Commission. You've actually confirmed
I have to take the guidance of my officials that we have acted within the requirements of the Equality Commission.
But you're unaware of what the Equality Commission, the arguments that were made by the Equality Commission.
I have accepted that my officials have said that we have acted within the requirements of the Equality Commission.
Well, I suggest that's not good enough, but anyway, thank you so much indeed. I may come back later.
Come again.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, I understand that you can't make immigration policy for the whole of the UK on an ad hoc basis, and that this is quite tortuous. But for me, it is quite clear. The people that Gregory refers to are British. It is a fundamental inequality that the fact that post-partition you had people on either side of the border who felt they were under the wrong jurisdiction, an anomaly that was righted as per the Good Friday Agreement for Irish citizens, people who felt they were Irish, who lived in Northern Ireland, were born in Northern Ireland, But that same equality, that same parity of esteem has not been extended to people in Northern Ireland who are British. The reason I get so exercised about Brexit and the border is because it is an incredibly porous border, and there are links right across it. The counties of Donegal, Cavan, Monaghan, Sligo, Leitrim, right across the Louth are intrinsically linked with counties in Northern Ireland. People live their lives, families have generations across both. So the people that Gregory referred to may have, for want of a better term, by accident of birth, had been born in Letterkenny or Dundalk, but their people, their hinterland, their home were in County Derry or County Armagh or wherever it was, and they are British and they feel British. Do you understand that, Minister? Do you accept that? Because the language that you've used about EU citizens and Irish citizens and the 27 and UK citizenship, that will be a huge insult to those people who are as proudly and patriotically British as my constituents in St Helens or indeed your constituents. Do you get that?
So, I do not wish to insult anyone. I absolutely accept that it is an incredibly long and porous land border which has, in many instances, absolutely no footpath or roadway to indicate where the border might fall. I think I was at the English-Irish Council some months ago when we had it pointed out to us, the analogy of cattle crossing the border, and one minute they were in Northern Ireland and the next minute they were in Ireland, and they didn't know when they were crossing and how could they. So obviously...
Cattle in the south for some reason don't have tuberculosis.
Thank you for that. So, I mean, obviously it's an incredibly long and border that has no demarcation points, and I had it very firmly explained to me at that event in Jersey that for communities and for individuals,
I get that. But the fundamental point is,
I don't want to insult anyone.
Yeah.
But I am very conscious that I have to uphold our immigration rules as they are, the naturalisation rules and the routes to applying for
No, I get
a passport.
that, but you know the funny thing is, there's been a lot in the news over the last 4 or 5 weeks about when you've got a policy wrong, like on Windrush, you've been able to change it to suit those specific circumstances. So what I want to hear from you, Minister, today is that it is difficult, it is complicated, but that you're going to go away from here and you're going to have a look at it and you're going to see if it can be changed. Because this, to me, goes to the heart of, and I'm glad to welcome colleagues to the Friends of and Cheerleaders of the Good Friday Agreement Club. But yes, the serious point is that this does, for me, go to the heart of it, because my friends and families and neighbours where I come from in County Armagh have had their Irishness validated. They were born, they live in Northern Ireland, but they are Irish. They choose to be Irish. They choose to be both, which is my right as well. But my family and friends and neighbours who live in the same part of the world, who are British and who want to be British and profess their Britishness, can't, for example, because of an accident of birth, if they were born in, as I say, a hospital across the border. It's not as if these are people who have travelled into Northern Ireland on some sojourn or through a lifestyle choice. They are instinctively from Northern Ireland. They may have been born outside the jurisdiction, but they may only have spent a matter of hours there before coming back in. Surely we can look at those cases with help from members of Parliament, institutions in Northern Ireland, and correct the wrong.
So I think it would be fair to say that I am anxious, that I should say nothing that disrupts, upsets the Belfast Agreement. I think that has to be an absolute imperative. However, when reflecting upon the evidence that I had to give today, I could not help but notice one of the Immigration Acts referred to in this pack is the 1971 Immigration Act. You will all be conscious over the last 6 weeks or so how much scrutiny that Act has come under. And it would be fair to say that when reflecting upon Windrush, I am very conscious that there may well be other groups of people who might be in a similarly difficult situation. However, what I cannot do today is change anything on the hoof. What I have to do is reflect upon what have been very clearly expressed as very strong feelings. And I think we are all very conscious that when it comes to, I hesitate to say accidents of birth, but this is something that we as an individual hold no control over. Our parents decide where we are born, if we are lucky. If they are unlucky, then it can happen anywhere, can't it? So I'm very conscious that there will be people affected, as you have outlined, and I have absolutely undertaken to the Chairman to go away and reflect in detail upon this.
So there is a follow-on from this, and it's not directly the same, because I think the point has been already made that if one is to interpret the Good Friday Agreement in the way that I feel it should be, then this is an issue specific to Northern Ireland. But Irish citizens in Great Britain are anxious or concerned about their status after the UK leaves the European Union, and there have been wildly conflicting reports about what the future holds for them. Now, similarly, it could be the case where a family moved from Dublin to Birmingham when the 3 children were under the age of 10. They've spent their whole lives here, worked, contributed to British society, have raised their families here, who have a hybrid British-Irish identity, but fundamentally are good, solid, decent British citizens who helped nurse the sick and teach the children and build this great country that we call home. Can you guarantee that Irish citizens who are resident in Great Britain today will have that right to remain with all of the benefits and privileges they enjoy now, that they will have that and continue to have that?
Yes.
Fine, that clears that up.
And the basis for your very clear commitment, the basis for that?
Okay, so I think 2 elements. Firstly, I'm very conscious that we take our obligations very seriously, and I am very conscious that for Irish citizens who will continue to have the right, so I'm not Irish citizens who are here today, but Irish citizens full stop will still be able to come and go as they always have done under protected rights that date back to 1922 and the Common Travel Area, and that we regard them as settled from day one, that they have all of the access to benefits and services, and that will be enduring. We take that very seriously.
That is very reassuring, and would be hugely reassuring for the hundreds of thousands of Irish people who live here. And then finally, Chair, if I might, it might be worth, Minister, when you're looking at what seems to be this intractable problem, to look as well at the status of those who have either refugee status or leave to remain who live in Northern Ireland. Because again, lots of people do go back and forward across the border to do their everyday business. Now, you answered very helpfully a parliamentary question that I asked about this in terms of saying that, of course, individuals had the right to leave and return to the UK and their status would be unaffected. But I just wondered if you might have discussions with your counterparts in the Irish government just to make sure that people don't feel that they're compromising themselves by travelling south, for example, to attend sporting events or for recreational activities, because there is a lot of that, and I'm particularly thinking of 2 young Syrian refugees whose families approached me about the fact they were taking part in a Gaelic football competition south of the border, but that they lived in Belfast, and they were just seeking assurance that they were doing the right thing and keeping within the rules. So the individual cases with your department, but just might be worth having a look at that.
Yeah, and I was very conscious that quite early on as a minister I had the opportunity to meet ministers from the Irish government. These are really important dialogues that we continue with, and of course always will. Our relations with our neighbours are crucially important, but I think you make a really important point, and we have done enormous work over the last few years with resettled communities and refugees. I am conscious that one of my first acts as Immigration Minister was a statutory instrument on the National Transfer Scheme, which enabled local authorities in Northern Ireland to accept unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and so it is crucially important that those children, when their rights are established in the United Kingdom, then be allowed to travel as freely as somebody who was born here.
Great. Thank you.
Ian, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister, it's not usual that nationalists, unionists, Labour, Conservative, DUP, Independent would all say the same thing on this issue of the passport and the amendment required to the Belfast Agreement. And I'm just saying there's no trap door in this for you, and you should take that as a gift and actually take this away and say, that's something I can actually do that's positive, because they're all asking for it. I'm just flagging that up to you as a result of the conversation you've had with various colleagues today. Could it go back to the issue that Lady Herman raised about the Equality Commission and these applications that were made for the Border Force people? You said in an answer to her that whenever the Equality Commission brought this matter to the attention of your officials, and I'm quoting you accurately, that you were obliged to remove that criteria. Were you obliged to remove it, or were you under an obligation to consider what they had said?
So equality legislation is law, is it not? And so I think it, as I've said, it was raised by the Equality Commission, and I think it is important that we make sure that recruitment campaigns act within the law.
But the military covenant is also the law. Did the Equality Commission trump the military covenant on this one? Or was it even looked at alongside? Was it even challenged? Was there any pushback at all by officials? Or did the Equality Commission just come in, wave their flag, blow their whistle and say, we want that changed?
I can't answer the specifics of how it happened. I think it's been made very clear to us that the recruitment campaign still perfectly allowed Border Force to reflect upon military and law enforcement service, but could not make it a specific criteria. I think following the Chair's comments, I will certainly go away and scrutinise how this process came about and what happened.
It against the military covenant as well? Thank you, I appreciate that. I think that's important. Could I turn to the issue of the level of demand for UK passports in the Republic of Ireland?
Yeah.
Is there a demand for UK passports emanated in the south of Ireland?
Yes, and it runs, apologies if I don't get to the right page, but it's around about 10,000 or so a year.
And those applicants, they can make them online?
Yeah.
And they're not discriminated against or upset in any way by not being able to go to an Irish post office?
Well, there are always going to be different processes for passport applications in different countries. I think Mr. Goodwill made a comment about, if you wish to travel in Italy, you can get an identity card from a town hall. Certainly in Ireland, you can get a passport from the post office. You'll be aware that in 2014, Her Majesty's Passport Office stopped the process or practice of issuing passports from the embassy in Dublin. We have been very determined over the last few years to promote digital applications, which certainly are the most efficient, cost-effective and simple way to apply for passports. And currently we see around about 50% of passports are applied for online, and we currently exceed service standard and routinely are returning passports within 7 working days.
Turning to the issue of visas for non-EU economic migrants. As you know, we have an issue in Northern Ireland with regards to Filipino fishermen.
Yep.
You've had numerous discussions about this matter. I wonder if you're able to update the committee with regards to how those fishermen who are bringing an expert trade and skill to our fishing fleet, both in Northern Ireland and the Western Isles of Scotland, how they're going to be treated in the years after Brexit.
So you'll be conscious that an immigration bill will come forward round about the turn of the year. I made my view very clear in repeated select committee appearances that I want to wait for the Migration Advisory Committee advice, which will be in September, which has looked at the labour market across the United Kingdom and the flows of labour and how different regions and different sectors of the economy are impacted by the availability of foreign workers, specifically EU workers. You are absolutely right to point out the issues with the fishing industry, and I'm very conscious that, as you say, it's not just Northern Ireland, but the Scottish fishing fleet and a very heavy reliance on overseas workers, predominantly from outside the EU. But what I also must reflect upon is the need to make sure that migrant workers' rights are protected. I think it would be fair to say I'm concerned about those who must be outside the 12-mile territorial limit for significant periods of time. I'm conscious of the abuses that we have seen historically with join ship visas, and I think it's really important that going forward we have an immigration system that reflects upon the needs of different sectors of the economy, but also is cognizant of the need to uphold workers' rights.
You would agree that there's been significant improvement in welfare and rights issues over the years?
Yeah, I would, and I can well remember you coming to see me on the day the Taylor Review into Modern Working Practices came out, and I think I made the point to you then how determined I am to make sure that fishing fleets are making sure that their workers have regular pay slips issued to them and that their conditions are upheld. But you're right to point out that there have been improvements, which we welcome.
Yes, we took evidence from the Anglo-North Irish Fisheries Association, and they pointed out that about 25% of the fishing fleet in Northern Ireland is Filipino or non-EU employees. They also indicated that before getting to that level, that over the last number of years they've run a local employment scheme to try and attract local people into the industry. Their last one, they offered over 50 jobs on the fishing fleet, and only 2 of those opportunities were taken up by locals. So there is a significant difficulty in getting local people, but also getting the proper skills, which and the proper experience, which is, going into the high seas is not something that you just do for the crack, as we would say. It's something which does require training and high skill to actually get there and be aware of all the dangers and the loneliness and all of the issues that go along with fishing on the high seas. So you do recognise this is going to be a problem that will need to be rectified very, very quickly to give the fishing industry confidence.
Yeah, and I think it is worth reflecting. So this is not a new issue, and it is a long-standing one. There are a number of sectors of the economy who wish to make the point to me that they can only obtain the workforce they need from overseas, potentially outside the European Union, because of course we will have free movement up until the end of December 2020. But I'm conscious that when we did offer specific visas for fishing, for those working in the fishing industry, I'm trying to avoid using the word fishermen, but for those working in the fishing industry, there was a very low take-up of the visas that were arranged, and I think back in 2009 there were only about 50 of those visas were taken up.
Yeah. Fishing crew.
Yeah, 50.
Fishing crews usually have.
Oh yeah, that's a good term, thank you.
In terms of the issue of customs posts, does that fall into your bailiwick?
So the customs regime will be determined ultimately by Her Majesty's Treasury and HMRC, but of course it will be for Border Force to enforce it.
You will be aware, I hope you're aware, that at the weekend your colleague, the Minister Steve Baker, very kindly put up a photograph of the hard border that the South of Ireland has erected around Northern Ireland with their customs posts and customs officials, gathering fuel samples from cars right on the Enniskillen border in this particular instance. And I'm wondering if you have any idea how frequently the South of Ireland erects that hard border.
So no, I don't, and I can't answer for the Irish Republic about how often they might carry out checks like that. I assume that was a check for people using red diesel,
yes,
and to make sure that people were paying for the correct.
Can I ask it the other way around? Are you aware how frequently Her Majesty's Customs and Excise do it in Northern Ireland?
No, I'm not.
You wouldn't be surprised if it was daily, though, I assume.
So I think it is important that the correct levels of taxation are paid by motorists, among others.
Yes, but you wouldn't be surprised if the customs officials in our jurisdiction, quite rightly, exercise their powers daily.
Well, so I would be surprised if it was daily, but I think it's important that we carry out an appropriate level of checks.
With over 50 million worth stolen from the Treasury last year in Northern Ireland in diesel alone. I would be alarmed if it wasn't daily. These checks were available at HMRC.
So I was merely reflecting upon the checks that you might see on the M27 motorway in my own constituency, and I think I've seen a red diesel check along there once since I could drive.
Yes. Yeah, I'm talking about on our border, the
Yeah,
Uri
okay.
and Armagh, Donegal, that border. You wouldn't be surprised if those checks were daily, and that's part of our border enforcement. Accept that?
Well, I would hope that HMRC carried out checks as were appropriate.
Okay, thank you.
But with respect on that, it's not just red diesel, it's the fact that oil is a different price, completely different price, so they're stopped quite regularly because there's smuggling going on. I mean, you must have seen, you haven't visited the border yet?
No, I haven't.
Because you'll see the customs sign up as you go through. There is a customs.
I think, the thing I've been conscious of since coming into this job is that smuggling is a problem. And that's why we have highly trained operatives identifying all sorts of substances, items that would be liable to duty, things that we wish to stop coming through the border altogether.
Yeah, so it's not frictionless.
But we are not going to have any infrastructure at the border.
No, and they don't have it at the moment.
And I'm
but
sure
it's
you're
not
not
frictionless.
comparing fuel smugglers and criminals.
The people who cross the border every day to go about their daily lives and be traders and things like that. So we're talking about two different things, aren't we? We're talking about like law enforcement, which is absolutely acceptable, and any impingement upon the rights of ordinary citizens to go about their everyday lives.
Yeah, that point is well made, and we'll perhaps return to that at a future date.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
There you go.
I might want to come back. So, in response to questions from my colleague Mr McGinn, the common travel area was mentioned several times. The common travel area, of course, only benefits those who are British citizens and Irish citizens. So, how is it proposed to take back control of the border in Northern Ireland post-Brexit in terms of other EU nationals who are perfectly entitled to come into the Republic of Ireland to exercise their free movement of workers' rights, perfectly entitled to do so. The Republic of Ireland stays within the EU, the UK is leaving. So how are we taking back control?
Well, certainly when it comes to the movement of goods, this is a matter that is to be discussed at the June Council.
Absolutely, it isn't actually goods, it is to do...
people.
I did talk about the common travel area, so it's actually people. How are we going to...
But at the moment we can carry out checks on third country nationals who might, for example, fly into Dublin, come across into Northern Ireland and then seek to get a ferry to
so how do
Great Britain. But we can carry out those checks at the moment, and indeed.
So how do we carry out those checks? They fly into Dublin Airport, they fly into Shannon. When you say we can carry out those checks when come across the border, how do we know they're not?
At ports for third country nationals, we're able to do that. And going forward, the issue of movement of people who are EU citizens, we will have to reflect upon the best way that we can manage that. But it is certainly one of the significant challenges that withdrawal from the European Union is giving us.
Yes, but the mantra was that we were taking back control of our borders, and I'm just asking you, how are we going to do that in South Armagh? How are we going to do that right around the border in Northern Ireland? Because the common travel area only benefits British and Irish citizens. How are we to know whether in fact someone coming across the border is
So we have been very clear that we respect the common travel area. There are challenges that the decision to leave the EU is posing to us. But as I said, we can carry out checks on third country nationals at the moment, and the future immigration system post EU exit will be something that we will have to work out how we can practically and effectively implement without reverting to what nobody wants, which is a hard border.
So they won't be able to get a job, will they? They won't be able to get a national insurance number if they're illegal. So, and we can send them back. which we can't at the moment.
Absolutely.
So there's not a problem really.
So, sorry, forgive me. So the Minister, please respond to that intervention.
No, I'm trying to
absolutely. Well, of course, we have a range of policies at the moment for people who have come into the United Kingdom without any leave to be here. The Honourable Lady is absolutely right. They don't have any right to rent property. They cannot work. We have the ability to prevent them accessing healthcare and benefits. But I think, obviously, members of the committee will be very aware of the challenges that poses to us if you have a significant illegal population.
And of course, if they come into Northern Ireland from the Republic of Ireland, the majority of them, I assume, want to then travel on to Great Britain, and of course they can be checked at the other place we don't want to see a hard border, but where checks take place, which is between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK.
Well, only for third country nationals we don't check those who are entitled to move freely within the common travel area and won't.
Sorry, so how does one know that without asking for identification? So I would like to know that when I travel from Northern Ireland as a British citizen, I go to Kenryan, or I go to Heathrow, I go to Flying. How will I be sure that I can rely upon my right to move within the United Kingdom without being asked to identify myself?
Well, that absolutely is the challenge, which we are determined to make sure that both Irish citizens and British citizens retain the right, whilst making sure that those who don't have that ability to travel freely are restricted from doing so. So currently we are as I've said, we are perfectly entitled to make checks at ports of people who are from outside the EU, and we do that. But it is...
so everyone will be checked?
No, absolutely not, because we have to allow and support free movement of those within the common travel area who are entitled to do so. And it's absolutely right to point out that this is a massive challenge to us, which we are...
So you're saying clearly today that those who are Irish citizens and British citizens and able to benefit from the common travel area, there will be no checks on their passports, on their identification, moving anywhere within the United Kingdom. That's what you're telling us today.
We absolutely respect that. I think it is worth reflecting that some airlines, in particular, already require passports.
But this will not be a government policy. There'll be no checks on those British or Irish citizens travelling.
I don't believe we can do that. We don't want to do that. We respect the right of people within the common travel area to travel freely. It's a right that has existed for decades and we support it.
Fantastic. In terms of UK border officials, how many are we recruiting in Northern Ireland?
I don't have the number broken down to those we're recruiting in Northern Ireland.
Really?
We have an aspiration to reach 1,500 additional border force
but you don't have the number
recruited. But no, I can't give that broken down by region.
But you would be able...
Yeah, I assume that information is available.
Well, one would assume before you were to start the recruitment drive that you would understand how many you needed for Northern Ireland, England, Scotland, and indeed Wales. As a matter of interest, I mean, obviously some will be deployed in Northern Ireland. So where's the plan? What is the plan? Where are these UK border? We started the recruitment drive, we've been through that in the early part of the evidence, we're not going over that again. But where exactly are they going to be deployed?
Well, there will be a range of roles at entry ports and across the United Kingdom.
So we're talking about Northern Ireland, so the entry ports in terms of Northern Ireland.
The detailed deployment plans sit very firmly with border force officials. And I would not expect as Minister to be able to dictate to them how many people I wanted to see where. That is for them to decide operatively going forward what the best solutions are.
So you as the Minister in charge of this department are not aware of the plans of the UK Border Force to deploy officers in Northern Ireland?
Not the numbers, no.
So the government minister who's sitting before us today, a government that has claimed that they're taking back control. Right? So, we're taking back control, but you don't know where we're taking back control in Northern Ireland in terms of people coming into Northern Ireland. That's what you're telling us today.
I'm telling you that these detailed operational requirements of Border Force.
But perhaps you could go back to them after this evidence.
I will certainly find out how many additional Border Force officers will be deployed in Northern Ireland, will be
Yes.
sought to be deployed in Northern Ireland.
Yes, and perhaps where they're going to be located. I think that'll be very helpful to the committee.
Certainly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, Minister, thank you ever so much for being with us this afternoon. We've covered a great deal of ground, and as you probably realise, matters that relate to Northern Ireland are rarely straightforward. I perceive that your officials will be filling your Whitsun red box with copies of the Good Friday and St Andrews Agreement, and indeed the determination made by the Equalities Commissioner's submission to Border Force in relation to the recruitment of Border Force personnel for Northern Ireland. You undertook to look into the primary matter that we raised with you today.
Yep.
That is what appears to be an inequitable handling of people resident in Northern Ireland, and we're very grateful to you for that. And what we will be doing, I shall be doing, is writing